Hello, I'm Jonny.
And I'm Kai.
And today we're out here in Lee Woods, and we're going to be doing a sort of debate on the topic of what is the moral standing of the biotic community.
Yeah, and so we've prepared quite a lot of our thoughts beforehand, so if you see us referring to our notes here, then that's what we're doing. It's not aimed to be a comprehensive look into like the depths of all of the literature. It's just going to kind of navigate through the main points.
Yeah, it's more of like a discussion than a
definitely.
debate. Like we've prepped this together, we've spoken about it all. Before we've come out here, we've kind of got a little bit of a script. We know what we're going to say.
Yeah, we basically just want to record it.
Yeah, I think the best part of this for us has been just talking about it and developing it, rather than coming out here and filming. I mean, it's still lovely out here, but the work's kind of been done beforehand rather than on the fly. So should we set out like what our structure's going to be?
Yeah, sure. So first we're going to kind of try and outline the default cultural position that somebody might have if they haven't encountered how this kind of applied issue fits into other ethical theories, and then we're going to move through an outline of first Kant, and we'll evaluate these after we outline each point. Then we'll move through Kant, course guard as a kind of development and extension of Kant, some kind of virtue ethics approaches with Nussbaum, and then I'll introduce a kind of reactionary ethic, like a social movement called animal liberation ethics, which I'm like very much in agreement with. And then
and so we'll go through all of that, and then we'll look at ethical holism and kind of a Leopoldian land ethic. I think the way we've structured it, you put it quite nicely, it's like just kind of a path through the literature. I think the main point of interest for us is whether we can reconcile animal liberation ethics and ethical holism, because they're both very environmentally focused, but they do have some conflicting aims. So we're kind of giving an outline and a brief assessment of each of the positions up until that point, right? And then I think that's the place that we've enjoyed discussing the most.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, obviously, just a kind of like disclaimer is that this isn't going to include absolutely everything. I mean, we've done, as Jonny said, like we've done most of the work beforehand, but there will be things that we miss out or that maybe we misrepresent, and like feedback about that process for
like if anyone actually has the time or energy to watch this whole thing, please do send us your thoughts, anything you think that we've got wrong, anything you think that we could develop, or just anything that you liked. With that in mind, should we just get started?
Yeah.
Cool. So I'm going to introduce moral humanism, which is kind of this default position, but I'm going to do that by kind of setting out the kind of logical space of this debate, which is something that Callacott does really nicely in their triangular affair argument, where they set out three oppositional views on the moral standing of the biotic community, right? And this kind of moral ethical humanism is that first point. As a general term, it means that only humans are morally considerable. And generally, the arguments for this sort of view go kind of like they're structured very similarly. So it's like premise one is rationality, for example, is the criterion by which moral considerability is determined. So if an entity has the capacity for rational thought, then you have moral obligations towards it. If an entity lacks the capacity, then you don't have any moral obligations towards it. Premise 2, humans have that capacity. Premise 3, non-human animals and non-human natural entities lack that capacity. Therefore we have moral obligations towards humans, and we don't have moral obligations towards non-human animals or natural entities. And so this is because the reason we don't have these moral obligations, or that these members of the biotic community don't have moral considerability, is because they lack some sort of crucial qualification. And this changes depending on the argument. So in a Kantian way, it's kind of rationality, but it also can be, having interests, being self-aware, having emotions, any sort of thing like that. But the important aspect is that there's some sort of qualification for ethical considerability which only humans fulfill. And I think really interestingly, this is kind of traditionally presented as, there's a Kantian way, and then Singer, who we're going to be talking about in our evaluation, presents some good counter-arguments to that rationality one. But I think it's important to note that he is still doing the same thing, right? So his objections still stand, but Singer says something like that there are people who don't satisfy this rationality criteria, and also that rationality itself is an odd criteria. But something that you need to note is that the utilitarian is no better than Kant. They're still providing a qualification by which moral considerability is justified. So as we're about to go into evaluating it, I think we're going to mention Singer as an opponent to that first view, but they're still very much in the same mix. But yeah, with that in mind.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's like our outline of it. Like, it's important to capture the fact that this is the kind of way you might intuitively think about the moral standing of, usually non-human animals, because normally we don't include other biotic entities in our discussion. That's just vis-a-vis our culture for it. And so this section is definitely about examining just exactly why we tend to advocate in our culture this position of having some type of moral superiority over non-human animals and other biotic entities that means that we can treat them in such and such ways. And yeah, definitely rationality as a criteria often seems to be the place that people go to. It's the chief point in Kantian ethics, is that, why are we better than non-human animals? And one main reason is that, they don't have capability for rationality, so that seems morally relevant, therefore we can treat them.
And this is where Singer comes in. It's like, we have these more developed abilities, that we have more rights in terms of suffering. And this is where Singer comes in, and he's like, look, animals can suffer too. They can feel pain, they have interests, they feel pleasure, they exhibit these preferences in just the same way as we do, and what matters to us morally is our preferences, our suffering, our pain. And so from a utilitarian perspective, it makes sense to include non-human animals in this discussion. But just in general, this being a default, I don't think anyone would disagree with that. I don't think it's a controversial point to say this is what we think. And I also don't think it's controversial to say that there's a lot wrong with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm guilty of this as well, because I do eat. I eat meat. So I'm implicit in all this factory farming stuff. No one looks at factory farms and goes, yes, that's good. But what is interesting is that we have a big, conceptual gap between what we pick up in the supermarket and the factory farm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So this cultural default obviously is problematic. Do you want to talk a little bit more formally about what Singer says?
Yeah. So it's important to flag Singer as kind of and I'll talk about this later a bit as well when I introduce animal liberation. Singer's quite famous for having this kind of cornerstone turning point in the dialogue about the ethical standing of non-human animals in particular, because as you mentioned before, it's any creature which is cognizant of its own suffering is going to have a preference by the nature of suffering to not suffer. So in this kind of very logical way, he just sets out that anything which can suffer, uses that as a kind of litmus test for ethical considerability. So you can see where he draws a line here. Anything which can suffer will have a preference not to, and anything which has preferences of that kind should be included in how we formulate our ethical behaviour. What we should consider in terms of how the consequences of our actions are going to spill out into the world. So that's really where he kind of draws a line in the sand for ethical consideration. And previous to Singer, it had come up before in Bentham and Mill with classical utilitarianism, but Singer's definitely a turning point for this kind of cultural position, I'd say.
Yeah, and so he's definitely a turning point, but then, I've dropped that, that's alright, I don't need it. But what's interesting is, as I kind of alluded to before, is that he's still doing the same thing as that Kantian moral humanist, right? If you structure his argument, it's identical, just using a different term. So it's, premise one, preference is the criterion by which moral considerability is determined. Premise two, humans and some non-human animals exhibit preference, so we should have obligations towards them. And then premise three, there are some natural entities that do not have these things, so we don't have moral obligations towards them.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And I think this is a point that we're going to, kind of come back to quite a lot today, is that we are looking for an ethic that not necessarily has to include the entire Biotic community, but at least like mentions them, and explains maybe why we don't have the same ethical considerations towards non-natural or natural entities in the Biotic community, because a lot of this default position doesn't even include biodiversity, ecosystems, this sort of thing. It's all about humans and animals.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're going to come back to that quite a lot, and I think just at this point, something that I did want to mention is the fry, which I read, I think it was in the Warren paper, about just the fact that if we're trying to bring out moral duties for non-human natural entities in virtue of their similarities to ourselves, we're always going to mischaracterize what it is to be that thing and how we can have a moral relationship with them. Not 100% certain of how that plays into this discussion, but I think it's something that we can think about, and maybe
I think that captures this kind of like recurring objection that we have really nicely, because I mean that just is the reason that we don't subscribe to Singer's preference utilitarianism. Is that like it's still coming from this like partial perspective, the human perspective on drawing a line for ethical considerability. So I mean, we'll see as well with Kant, who will outline that this pops up over and over again with the kind of like classical ethical theory. So
I mean, that seems like a pretty good segue if you want to.
I mean, we've seen the default cultural position has these kind of really important conceptual challenges, especially when you think about Singer, and we'll see that later with how that manifests in like our culture with the animal liberation movement. But like something interesting to consider is just at least to lay out how this like applied issue of non-human animals and the biotic community sits within the rest of the kind of like classical triumvirate of ethical theories. Like we've already got
that Caldecott structure again.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we've already got preference utilitarianism with Singer and the like our default cultural position. So looking at how it fits into Kantian ethics is kind of the natural progression for us. Okay, so the main argument in Kantian ethics and like traditional Kantian ethics is that we have indirect obligations to non-human animals because of the principle of humanity, right? And so the idea is something like this. I've got the premise for it. So in accordance with the categorical imperative, our actions towards other animals do not themselves relate to moral duties. And that is to say, there are no moral maxims which fail the test of universalizability or the humanity principle by definition, which are about non-human animals, just in terms of their reasoning, right? And I mean, Korsgaard will take an issue with this later on, but this is the traditional Kantian view. The way that Kant frames non-human animals then is that and actually I've got a quote here as well, which is quite nice. A person, if he is not to stifle his human feelings, must practice kindness towards animals, for he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men. Therefore, we should treat non-human animals with respect and consideration, is the kind of takeaway. So Kant's perspective, in a nutshell, is that maybe we don't have direct obligations according to the normal Kantian framework for ethics, but we do at least have indirect obligations, because to not treat animals with respect and consideration reflects poorly on our moral character in how we would deal with other people. So it's like, in reference to our treatment of other humans, we should at least still respect animals. That's the chief point of Kantian ethics for non-human animals.
Nice. So I think in terms of evaluating this position, right, we've spoken about a couple of problems with not having direct duties already, and a lot of the objections that you might have to Kant's view are born on the back of just not liking Kantian ethics, right? So instead of like getting bogged down in kind of a metaethical debate of deontology and Kantian ethics, we just want to move on quite quickly to cause guard, because cause guard does something really interesting, which is that they basically provide maybe a defence or an alteration of Kant's ethics, which is kind of like saying, look, I know that Kant never actually said this out loud, but if you follow the logical consequences of it, Kant actually is saying that we have direct duties to animals, even though they didn't realise it themselves. And so what they do is they try and show that Kant's ethic entails this direct duties. Just full disclosure, I am stealing Anthony's sat at this because in the lecture it's a very complex paper and he did it really nicely. I'm just going to set that out now. So it's like premise 1: the difference between being an agent and an object, a you and an it, is incremental rather than black and white, and is acting for reasons that we choose. Okay? So people are aware of the external world, and they're also aware of their own beliefs and their desires. So one can distance themselves from their beliefs and desires and sort of question them, ask, well, should I have these beliefs? Should I have these desires? And so what happens is we decide whether a given desire is grounds to act, and in doing so we endorse or we reject that desire, that belief. So we're kind of legislating on them, and this is the kind of criteria of our being a subject, of being a you, is this process of rational reflection and legislation. Right. So to be a subject, I have to value myself as a rational chooser. I have to have the belief that I'm a rational chooser, and endorse that. And so when I endorse something as an end, I confer value upon it and also myself in the process. So for example, if I value a painting, I value it because it's beautiful. I'm endorsing beauty, so I should value all beautiful paintings, right? And so to say something otherwise would be inconsistent according to Korsgaard. And so kind of premise 4 of this is valuing ourselves as rational choosers requires us to value all rational choosers as a point of coherence and consistency. Because if you rationally value yourself, you should rationally value other people for the same reasons, just like the painting. And this is where she brings the animals into it, the non-human animals. So many non-human animals have an animal nature, that they pursue and they are at least implicitly aware of. They've all got, for lack of a better word, a purpose that they're trying to move towards. And so that means that their own good, at least implicitly, matters to them. And so this is where she links it. She says that we're the same. Many of the incentives that we rationally endorse with our rational nature act upon our animal nature. And so in endorsing them, we place value on our animal natures. And so as such, we should place value on animal natures in general. It doesn't matter that the animals don't have the capacity to be legislators. It's a bit like, I think Anthony gave the example of a world in which free speech was a law, but women didn't have the vote to make that law. Women are still protected by the free speech law.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's the same thing with these animals. So we do still have direct moral duties to them, even though they weren't there to legislate. And that's, I think, pretty much.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's important in terms of aim of addressing this question. Like we've moved through Kant into Korsgaard very quickly. But I mean, the reason for that is that Korsgaard, I think at least we should understand as a kind of extension of Kant's original reasoning, much in the way that you said of like, Kant didn't say this exactly, but this is what his reasoning implies. And there are some technical points that we could object to with Korsgaard,
Which they're a little bit pernickety.
They are, and I mean, to be honest, I think we're quite in agreement with at least the soundness of her argument, because at least in our minds, it seems that objections to like what you're endorsing, like with the painting example of like you endorse beauty generally, you endorse this painting, like you might take objection to it. But actually, if you examine the original Kantian framework, like these things,
within a Kantian framework, it makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like you are It's like if you take the principle of the goodwill from Kant, then
of course that's probably right.
It just follows a priori that legislation is part of your activity in the world. Otherwise, those maxims will be illogical vis-a-vis universalization.
So that's kind of the crux of this evaluation.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, therefore we capture the non-human animals.
So I think if you agree with Kant, then you have to agree with Korsgaard, because I think it's a brilliant paper, and I agree with the moves she makes, but that's within a Kantian framework.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you don't agree with Kantian ethics, you're going to struggle to adopt this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which I think is where we both, struggle, because I think the paper does really well in moving, like adapting and extending Kant, but still doesn't mean I like Kant. Especially in this, I don't know, environmental
Yeah,
sense.
absolutely. I mean that's the trouble, isn't it? Like, we don't want to move our discussion into a meta-ethical discussion about. I mean, we do in some ways, but we don't want to move it into
like what we like and what we don't like.
Right, exactly. It's like,
because that's not environmental.
Yeah.
That's just ethics.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
And we want to focus on the environmental stuff. So we're going to kind of park the what do you think about Kant discussion, because I think that's something that people have been debating for hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of back and forth.
Not that many, but
Yeah. There's a lot of like dialectic literature you can read on that, which is really interesting, but it's not kind of the aim of our discussion.
Yeah.
If you can't already tell about like our outline, and also how we're going to outline the other things, the main focus is about this like reconciliation that we talked about at the beginning, in light of the cultural default. So yeah, with that in mind, the third position we want to really address is how it comes under virtue ethics, and this is a kind of, and not exactly Aristotelian virtue ethics, but you could at least frame it as having Aristotelian roots.
Yeah.
And it's Nussbaum's paper, let's see, the moral status of animals. So she introduces something she calls the capabilities approach, which, and like we should consider this paper as like an introduction to that approach. And she does actually have a book which defends it later on and like fleshes it out,
which we haven't read.
Which is fine, because we're not so much interested in like the very details of her theories we just touched on. It's more kind of like the layout of the literature. So, for in a very virtue ethical sense, what is with flourishing and life in Aristotelian terms, and at least the moral claim which she explicitly makes in this paper, as far as we understand it, is that activities are bad if they inhibit a creature's ability to fulfill those functions which are important and good to it. And that's quite a lot of like dense philosophical language, but in essence what it's saying is that there is some good to a creature. And I think a few lectures ago we talked about the distinction between like good for green fly and good for green fly.
Yeah.
And so the idea was broadly like, if you have green fly in a greenhouse, and you're a gardener, you might say, oh, this spray is really good for green fly.
Yeah.
And what you mean is that it's really good for killing green fly.
Which is not good for the green fly itself.
Right, exactly. And that's really bad for green fly.
Yeah.
But the flip side of the coin of this definition is that you take it in the other sense, which is that, I don't know what is actually good for green flies, but
probably the plants in the greenhouse.
Yeah, probably the plants in the greenhouse, right. So you'd say the plants in the greenhouse are good for green fly. And that's the sense in which Nussbaum's talking about it, is like, there are goods to animals which give us a kind of evaluative standpoint. So we can say, well, if this is good for this creature, and it's quite nice because this includes things like insects or invertebrates. There's a good for quite a lot of these types of things. Gives us an evaluative standard to say, well, this one is flourishing, this one isn't flourishing.
Yeah. Although she does put a cap on it, doesn't she? Was it sentience?
Yeah, I think so sentience is it's got, like with Singer, how with Singer it's like preference according to suffering. Nussbaum is sentience is the
according to good. Yeah,
exactly. It's the barrier for ethical considerability, and I think her idea is that you can't be cognizant of your good or like aim towards it if you're not sentient. So, that's the crux of Nussbaum's point. And I mean, to emphasise what it means for in an ethical sense, our obligations are just to try to avoid impeding the flourishing of other creatures.
Yeah.
However,
it's like a virtue ethics position, isn't it? Rather than like a consequentialist or a deontological. And I mean, she gives herself a little bit of evaluation. in that paper. You know, she says that it goes beyond can in seeing our duties to animals as direct. So it goes beyond that, and it goes beyond the intuitive starting point of utilitarianism. So she feels like she's done, a better job than both of them, which, to be fair, I probably agree with. Just because it is a bit more wider regarding, and also it avoids somewhat that problem that I mentioned earlier with Fry. Because what she's doing is not going, oh, well, this is something I have and this is something that the animal has and it's the same, so we should value them. It's that, the green fly's good is very distinct from mine, and it's their good that we should be respecting, not exactly. Ours that is mirrored in them.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, she does, address these kinds of examples of, like, it's actually important to think about in terms of being a virtuous agent, which of course is the aim for, this kind of ethics. It's important to think about these kinds of differences, very much in Fry's sense, that we, like, are very unlikely to actually know what those goods might look like for other creatures. I talked about it as giving us a kind of evaluative standard. That's like if we know about them, at least. And so I think her examples, like a tiger in a zoo, who's in captivity, it's in a human context, we'd condemn hunting people, or anything like that, kind of like predatory behaviour, violence, in a violent sense, as being just not conducive to it. Exactly. So it's like the recognition of these differences is the point where this really becomes like virtue ethical. Is like you exercise your practical wisdom, and act in a virtuous way to recognise these differences and be like, well, maybe we should put like a gazelle or something if we can avoid it. Maybe that is the right thing to do, but maybe according to this case, like maybe we can use a weighted rope or something that exercises the tiger and so.
And it's not as prescriptive as the consequentialist or the delta, the Kantian. Because it's not saying we have to maximise their flourishing. It's that we don't want to put any obstacles in the way of them, because it would be just as kind of arrogant and look at us. We have rationality to go, well, we should decide and figure out what your good is, and then make sure you get it.
Point,
Instead, it's making sure we're not putting the barriers in the way, right? And I think that's really interesting, and it's a bit more virtue ethics style because it's not giving you like specific prescriptive action. It's saying this is what we should be looking to do. But again, it's an interesting cap that Nussbaum places, right, on sentience, because again, with a cap, you're limiting yourself to certain members of the Biotic community. And I think there's some interesting reasons why that could be the case that I don't think necessarily we looked a huge amount into. For example, I know that there's a Kayan paper that is titled like Against the Moral Considerability of Ecosystems, which I think if we wanted to develop these ideas, that would be our next step.
That's a good starting point,
yeah. But it's just, I think the point of scope of that it doesn't include any non-sentient natural entities is an interesting choice that I think we're going to discuss a bit later with the ethical holism perspective. So I think we're going to place a cap on that discussion for now and kind of come back to it when we get to ethical holism.
Yeah, absolutely.
This,
so, the kind of position, the kind of route that we mapped through this literature. I mean, obviously we started with this default cultural position, and
which
like
we've obviously got
response
our problems with.
Of course. And then how it might fit into a traditional Kantian framework. Of course, God is an evaluation of that, and now Nussbaum in a contemporary virtue ethical sense.
Yeah.
And that's very much like the traditional ethical discussion, which treats this as like an applied topic. It's like, okay, how should I be good? Let's look at these theories. How do they include these sort of 5 things? But definitely the crux of our discussion is going to be more this kind of thing, which is that I think it's important to note that at least with Nussbaum, we mentioned before that we don't have many problems with Korsgaard's paper. Just to bring it back to Korsgaard, we don't have many problems with her paper. It's more that we
with Kant.
Right, it's more a meta-ethical problem that we have, which we don't want to devolve into, that we use in Kantian ethics. I think something nice to flag up for Korsgaard is that simplest forms of argument to some extent.
To some extent, yeah.
But actually, our discussion's now going to kind of shift gears and take more of a focus on something which Jonny will introduce in a little bit, which is a kind of virtue ethics on a wider scale with the Biotic community. And now what I'm going to talk about and outline a little bit is, I mentioned Singer before as being a kind of turning point in ethical discussion, and his book actually is called Animal Liberation, I think. Animal Liberation, yeah. I mean, he has many books, but this was like quite a famous one, which is characteristic of this kind of reactionary ethic, which I very much subscribe to, and I came into this whole process of like research and discussion already having in mind. And so this is called animal liberation ethics, right? So it's just important to distinguish that we have the framework of traditional ethics, and then we have this kind of social movement, which is more like a collection of arguments and common values than it is a formal layout of like a moral landscape.
And I think that's something very important to note, is like it's not a formalised moral doctrine, which I think is going to play into quite a lot of our points later. Is that there's no unified, book. There's no
exactly.
There's no Mill on utilitarianism. There's no Kant's critiques. Like, it's very much a social movement that's kind of been building and developing.
Yeah, and I mean, something that was actually quite nice, that captures that quite nicely as part of our when we were preparing all of this, was I think your question that was like, when we're trying to prepare some evaluative points and really what we think about it was, well, what is an argument in common that all animal liberationists would probably advocate, right?
Yeah.
And it's quite hard to pin that down, which really is indicative of this kind of like collective nature rather than a formal framework, because it's just a collection of people and their ideas rather than anything else. But I have tried to prepare some like a few different cases or like general argument forms that at least animal liberation ethics tends to prescribe, and they're the ones like usually that we're quite familiar with. So the best way to outline this is that in light of the cultural default being that humans are morally superior, we have this kind of like three-premise argument, which is both an argument in a traditional sense, but it's also kind of a call to action. It's kind of like a motivating argument, which is at least. And so that three-premise goes something like, we have the cultural position, it's for some reason or another wrong. And then we're going to assume that's the premise truth. And say, in light of that, how does it reflect on our current treatment of if this cultural position of superiority is wrong? And then, consequent to examining this treatment, what should we do now? Like, what's left? And so I think the simplest way to put this whole thing is, if you think of like a vegan that you know or something. So a disclaimer I didn't mention at the beginning is I am a vegan as well. I mean, like, I mean, it was in our little intro script. Like, I was raised in a Buddhist family. Like, I'm a vegan, and as I mentioned, I came into this discussion like advocating these points. The best way to frame it is like the kinds of things that vegans tend to say, like the arguments they tend to give. And I mean, there's an evaluative point of like, we don't want to mischaracterize the movement, because I think there's a very fair and less controversial formulation of animal liberation ethics that we can quite happily like agree upon.
And there's also quite a lot of stigma, both casual and formal, about some of the arguments that vegans might make.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess the main point is that kind of like, this isn't so much, animal liberation ethics isn't so much the kind of thing that's like screaming at you for drinking dairy milk.
Yeah.
It's more the kind of thing of like, this is something that I think will better the culture and our treatment of non-human animals animals in light of the default position. So I realised I still haven't addressed the actual like crux argument, and that is just that the default position can't be justified, and that's in light of rationality being an arbitrary standard or a wrong standard.
Like the Singer stuff that you mentioned.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Singer's argument, and that's why he's so integral to this, or characteristic of this movement. And then, I mean, our argument, our recurring argument of ethical considerability also applies the same thing. And I think it's fairly obvious to say that our treatment, by and large, of non-human animals is problematic.
Yeah.
I mean, the way I characterised it in this script was that it's like an obvious moral wrong, you know? I mean, you mentioned factory farms before, like, it's obviously, you know, even in Kantian ethics, like, there's no care or consideration in the restrictive environments that you put chickens in, things like
There's
that.
a reason that we don't see the factory farms.
Exactly, right.
And it's because it's easy when we don't.
Yeah, I mean, bang on. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that's becoming more talked about in our culture with, I mean, I think Asda actually just released a like an all vegan or like gluten-free aisle or something. I think it was Asda or something. There was some like supermarket that had all like vegan.
That farming reform, which I don't know if, I mean, it's worth mentioning, that the government has now changed incentives for farmers,
Right,
so
okay.
that instead of getting paid on the amount of produce they're like shipping out,
Right.
they get incentives based on environmental considerability,
Oh, cool. Okay.
conservation. So it's like a really big move.
Right.
To make farms and agriculture more sustainable, and to reward farmers for doing it as well. So it's kind of like something we're going to talk about in a bit. It's a bit of a
Yeah, and so that's quite nice as well, because it ties into a point I wanted to make, which is that the arguments which, at least to answer that question of like what might animal liberation ethicists agree on, it's very akin to the kind of arguments that at least tend to be quite convincing, and that's something like refraining from meat or animal products because of their detriment to the environment, which is like, I mean, in some ways debated, the like evidence for it, but it's fairly widely recognised in the agricultural industry, and refraining from it in your like own diet. And this is the reason that vegans kind of are a product of animal liberation ethics. Kind of comes out as part of that. So you might have these things like environmental arguments. Another one is this something more conceptual, which is actually the argument which converted me to veganism.
Yeah.
I say converted as if it's like some kind of cult.
Yeah.
I mean, like,
Also, I don't imagine it was a difficult conversion
No.
to convert a
Right.
Buddhist to a vegan.
right. It's like if you've been a vegetarian your whole life,
Yeah.
like being or most of your life, then like being a vegan isn't much of a jump.
No.
But yeah, so it was this argument of a kind of an appeal to like moral consistency. So the idea is something like, I think the form I originally found it in was, so there are these kinds of things which we tend to value, and consent, appropriation of property, and such like tend to be among them. And the idea is that actually when we examine the case of like non-human animals, and then examine like a morally relevantly similar case of human beings, you would deny the actions, or you would call them morally wrong in the case of the humans, but not in the case of the animals.
Yeah.
Right, and the key logical point of this is that you can quite easily think of situations where actually morally relevant characteristics might be very similar. Like you have particularly intelligent great apes, pigs.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think we listed some other.
Yeah, we did. I mean, dolphins.
Dolphins. Yeah.
I've seen internet facts about elephants being very
exactly.
emotionally developed.
Right, and it's like, so you have some of these animals which have these like things like emotional intelligence, intrapersonal intelligence, where it recognize themselves in mirrors, these types of things, like the tests for consciousness. And actually, you can have people who are disabled, human people who are disabled in such a way that these like capabilities for rationality are almost equivalent, if not at least very similar to these like more like intelligent.
I think a good example that just came to me, and if you haven't seen them, look it up. Bunny the talking dog uses like vocal buttons with their owner, who's like a language therapist.
Right.
And they've shown that Bunny has the linguistic mental capacities of a 4-year-old.
Right, exactly.
And you know, she's a dog.
Yeah, cool. Right, so exactly, it's like it's not that difficult. Like maybe it seems strange, but it's not that difficult to compare cases of human beings who are morally relevantly similar to non-human animals.
Yeah.
And then the trouble is that if we look at our treatment of non-human animals, and it's like butchering them for meat, skinning them, appropriating their activities, right? You know, it's morally deplorable that you do that to a human being.
Yeah.
Like quite obviously, right? You know,
maybe not for Singer, but
maybe not for Singer,
but the point still stands.
True. Yeah. Exactly, and so that's important as well. It's like the point of this argument, as I said before, is like an appeal to your moral consistency. So the idea is just that, to kind of wrap this up, if you value these things like consent and which would apply to these moral situations, and if we can make these relevantly similar cases, then either you should advocate both or neither.
I mean, the Warren paper is a great example of that, isn't it? I mean, it draws a parallel between feminism trying to stop sexism and kind of speciesism, and how there's an identical logic of domination.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Callacott talks about the kind of social agreements that we form with domesticated animals and how we're breaking those bonds. And so I think there's a lot of literature actually that might not necessarily agree with each other on every single formal point, but there's quite a lot along this vein. With that in mind, we do want to try and do like a bit of evaluation rather than just talk about it. But I want to say that the points I'm making, I'm not making from like our default position, because they're going to come across a bit like, well, why are you saying that this is bad? Instead, they're actually coming from kind of beyond. They're coming from Leopold's side. So I definitely agree, and this is something that we're going to come back to when we're trying to reconcile the two views. So my question really is that, you know, vegans and animal liberation ethicists, you know, they say that killing animals, consuming animal products is immoral. Why?
Right, and so this is like, I think is a perfectly fair thing to ask, because I mean, if somebody's, you know, advocating anything along these kinds of broad lines of animal liberation ethics, then it's the reasonable question.
And from the Leopoldian perspective, just for example, you know, he's perfectly fine with people hunting and killing animals to feed themselves and things like this. So I think it is just worth saying at this moment that there are environmental ethics that do allow these activities, but you know, there's a couple of considerations that just kind of want to draw out in a kind of dialectic before we segue into that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So I mean, to answer your question, and I mean, it's not so much a straightforward answer, of course, but it's that animal liberation ethics isn't so much in the business of determining whether something is moral or immoral. It's like, I just want to bring it back to like this original, like, very simple 3-premise argument that I kind of like tried to pull out of, I think, the best case for animal liberation ethics, right? Is that if we assume the cultural position is wrong, then we look at our treatment of moral animals and find obvious moral wrongs. And then, in light of that, what do we do, right? It's like an open question. And so the key point of that is like the second premise is like assuming the fault in our cultural position. And I mean, you've already said that you're coming at it from a kind of different angle. Then actually, the point is that there are things which are obviously bad. Right? So like, maybe we could answer it in a weak sense by saying factory farming, or like something like that.
And to be fair, I don't think it's something we need to get too hung up on.
Right.
I think the main thing I'm trying to draw out is the conflict between animal liberation ethics and ethical holism, which we're about to get onto. And I guess, we can come back to this as we're trying to reconcile. But the main conflict that I see is, in the, killing animals is wrong. And there's another distinction that I think it might have been Callacott that made about how animal liberation ethics perceives domestic and wild animals. But to be honest, I don't think that's a serious problem more than, hey, animal liberation ethicists, this is something you need to think about. But
there are quite complex cases in some points, and I mean, things like the like honey industry, like treatment of bees. You have these things like Africanization of hives.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about that.
Right, it's like, like beekeepers usually can wear shorts and t-shirt and gloves when they deal with their hives and stuff. And I mean, maybe they're selling honey, maybe they're just keeping bees as a project, maybe they're in conservation, have a conservation aim. But like you have these kind of morally grey areas where actually there are a lot of different factors to consider. Like an Africanized hive will, go and attack like dogs and children, prevent the other bees from being kept as well. So, how should you deal with that? Are the kind of really tricky points that animal liberation ethics can encounter, and I definitely recognise that. But at least in the main, I think for sure there are like some things, and this is the point where it's like a reactionary ethic. I think there are just some things which are, if we assume the fault in the cultural position, are so obviously bad that you have to do something about them.
Yeah, awesome. And I want to keep the phrase reactionary ethic in mind as we're going to move on to ethical holism, because when we come back to our reconciliation effort, that's our path through, right? But with that in mind, I do want to move on to ethical holism, because I think we've outlined that pretty well. And so just before I do go into it, I've put together this kind of version of ethical holism, and it very well could be the case that someone might disagree with how I'm setting it out, because I have kind of set it out in my own way, but somewhat similarly to the animal liberation ethics, it's not like a determined thing, at least from the reading we've had. Like Leopold certainly has some form of it, but there's no unified ethical holist dogma, right? And so I want to kind of present it as a reconception of ethics that's a little bit like virtue ethics, because it's not necessarily giving specific actions guidance. So whereas the deontologist might say this action is right because of your intention, the consequentialist might say it's wrong because of the consequences. Virtue ethicists would say that you want to cultivate a set of virtues within yourself. And how I perceive ethical holism is as a sort of a communitarian virtue ethic, I'll kind of explain what I mean, or at least I'll try to. So I'm not sure if it's a perfect analogy between virtue ethics and ethical holism, but Leopold's big thing is that an action is generally right or good when it promotes or maintains the stability, beauty and integrity of the biotic community. And to me, they seem like three virtues that as a community we want to cultivate, rather than this action is good because of the consequences of this. So I don't think it's a consequentialist theory, and that's what I sort of mean as like it's sort of like a virtue ethic. But yeah, because it's similar to saying in the same way an action is generally right or good when it promotes or maintains the virtue of a person, right? He's identified the virtues of a community and is saying we should look to cultivate these. And so what ethical holism requires us to do is reconceive the natural landscape as a unified system of integrally related parts, which is a very, very fancy way of saying we're all connected. Because we've got individuals like me and you, like singular blades of grass, single plants, the wood lice under this log, and then we've got systems within that, prey, predator, food chains, all of that. And then we've got the entire ecosystem as a whole. And that is the biotic community, is that entire ecosystem. And so that's what it means. And ecology is what allows us to do this. It's this, kind of growing field, and we're understanding more and more, how ecology works, how biotic communities function, what roles need to be performed, what does what, this sort of thing. And what we're finding is a clear analogy between, the biotic community and human communities. And so in the same way that we might have an obligation not to harm human society, the land ethic brings these same obligations into our status as a member of the biotic society, the biotic community. And so Leopold's given us that obligation. So to not harm our biotic society means to maintain the stability, beauty and integrity of it. Okay. And this is the standard by which we can judge the actions of members of the community. So a really great example of this, I think, is his Thinking Like a Mountain paper. Because, and we'll get on to the animal liberation stuff in a bit, but if you say to the wolf, killing deer is wrong, then what happens in the long term is that the deer population booms. Then the deer absolutely cleanse the mountain of all its shrubbery, and then they all starve to death, and then the mountain is desolate, and everybody dies. So the stability of the biotic community is maintained by the wolf. The wolf also maintains the beauty of the mountain, because if there's no wolves there, people will probably hike more freely, they'll litter more. More paths will be cut through the natural shrubbery and vegetation, and the beauty will be compromised. And then obviously the integrity as well, because the more domesticated it becomes, the less wild it becomes. Right. That's the sort of integrity element of it. And so the Thinking Like a Mountain example just, I think, brings out perfectly that sort of that aim. And so this is how we build our ethic, right? It's not from a position that determines what's worthy of moral considerability. It's not saying, well, you deserve to be considered, we should have obligations to you, but you don't deserve anything. It's just thinking, what is it that we ought to do as members of this community to maintain the beauty, stability and integrity of it? And that's the ethic.
Yeah, I mean, something I really like about that is, and I mean, maybe it seems odd from the kind of default cultural position, but it's definitely the inclusion and consideration of the whole biotic community. And I mean, that's the reason we titled our discussion on this kind of question, right?
It's because it actually brings it in.
Exactly, right. It's just discussing the our moral attitudes to the biotic community as a whole, because I mean, it's definitely the case that, I mean, it's in the name, animal liberation. Ethics is concerned with the liberation of animals. And I mean, with Leopold's land ethic and definitely your outline of ethical holism, it touches on that. Was it Fry's point?
There's a really good example of climbing a rock. If you climb the rock trying to conquer it, then you're not appreciating it in the same way as if you're trying to work with the rock, which sounds a bit arty-farty, but what they're trying to get at is the fact that if you're only thinking about moral worth or just worth in general from a human perspective, then you're going to misappreciate and misrepresent that rock. And in the same way, if we only think about all of this wonderful stuff around us in terms of what we are, you're going to mischaracterize it. This place isn't great because it's got paths, it's great because of all of the bits around it. And it's great because the birds live in the trees and the grass grows out of the soil and the worms feed the birds, and it's because of the whole ecology of it.
Exactly.
Rather than just the fact that we can access it and it looks good to us and all of this stuff. And all of the things I'm saying now probably spur out into massive debates over aesthetics and all of that stuff, but I think the point still stands.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, so one evaluative point that we kind of prepared beforehand, and I think it's really interesting to consider for ethical holism, is, I mean, I just flagged that as something I think which is pretty great about Leopold's land ethic and your conception of ethical holism. But something interesting it leads to is like maybe the idea that there are situations which might seem quite problematic if
you're consistent.
Right. Like if we're consistent with this land ethic and ethical holism, then like I mean you mentioned like wolves and like deer and like the mountain before, and about like population control, and like maybe there are situations where if we think about that like environmental argument from animal liberation ethics, like there are just obvious advantages to the stability, beauty, and what was the other? Beauty, stability, integrity of the biotic community, right? If, for example, like you have a smaller population of people.
Basically that objection is, well, so are you saying we should cull humans in the same way we
right? Precisely. Yeah.
Awesome. It's an I have a response to it that I'm not sure whether other people would agree. And to start it, bear with me through the whole thing, but the start is to say kind of to be consistent, we would have to say that we should, I don't know, cull's probably the wrong word with what I'm about to go on to say, but the population at the moment is obviously a huge problem, and we do need to solve it. But I have a kind of two-part response to why this isn't so unsustainable, right? And the first is that these methods don't have to be cruel, the way in which we do these. We're trying to maintain the beauty, integrity and stability of the environment, but we're not by any means saying that we have to live a wild life. So in the same way that we don't think that great spanning diseases that kill swathes and swathes of animals or people are good, the same way we still have medicine, the same way that as long as it's not damaging the environment, no one's gonna contest us having a bit of heating in our homes. We don't have to go out and go, well, to be consistent, we've got to kill everyone.
Right, sure.
Instead, we can just introduce, measures that are a bit more sustainable and a bit more kind, for lack of a better word. Such as like incentives for sustainability, like that farming one we mentioned earlier.
Sure.
Family planning measures to reduce just endless reproduction. Education on contraception and how sex works. And these can all resolve the issue. Okay, it doesn't require us to go. We've got to, we've just got to exterminate half the world. I guess it's a bit analogous to when you go bankrupt, right? On first glance, ethical holism might be saying a bit like the loan shark, it's going to come break your knees because you've gone bankrupt. But the bank doesn't do that. The bank, gives you a bailout and helps you to get back to financial security. I think, I don't know, I've never gone bankrupt, but I don't think they break your knees. We don't have to mirror the cruelty of the natural world just to maintain its beauty, stability and integrity. Like in the same way that if you say that, a bear mauls a family in Canada while they're hiking, you wouldn't call that a good thing, even if it does maintain the beauty, stability and integrity. It's an unfortunate event. You don't put down the bear, you don't change the forest. Like, the point is that it's there and it is wild. But we don't have to mirror that cruelty in our own society. We just have to protect these three communitarian virtues of the ecosystem. All we're doing is using our own abilities to make life less painful and enact these measures in considerable ways. The second thing, which I think is really important, hopefully that can be discussed with, is that I want us to be viewing ethical holism as an end point. It's a journey to get there. There is no way that we can transition to this thing overnight. And even the stuff about developing a land ethic and kind of getting there. So it's not a case that we have a population that decided to adopt a land ethic. Okay, great, let's wipe out 3 billion people.
Yeah, sure.
It's what measures are we putting in place to get towards a land ethic, to get towards ethical holism. Okay. Because if ethical holism was the case, we wouldn't have this problem of population control, because we'd already have these measures in place. You know, if everything from city design, agriculture, family planning, industry, it was all oriented in an ethical, honest way, like in the name of sustainability and respect, and beauty, integrity, stability, none of these problems would even exist. And so, I think when people sort of say, oh well, look, it's not sustainable, we can't do it, this isn't a realistic ethic, I think that's because it's not a realistic ethic to just jump to. You can't go 0 to 100. You've got to start building it. And I think hopefully the sort of measures we're beginning to see, I mean, fingers crossed they're not too little too late, but is trying to develop a land ethic. And that's what we need to do, is we need to try and develop, we need to build new infrastructure that is focused around sustainability. Like we need a carbon market, this sort of stuff. And that's what the land ethic is about. It's about this journey towards ethical holism. It's not the same as saying one day, well, yesterday I thought that my actions were good because of their consequences, and now I think it's because of their intentions. It's I need to change the way in which I'm living.
Yeah, sure.
And that's what it is. And a bit like with and I'm going to come back to this analogy of the virtue ethics, because I do actually think it is a communitarian virtue ethics. When someone starts virtue ethics, the whole point is that they're trying to practice these virtues and cultivate them within themselves. They're not going, I failed to do these things, ergo I'm a bad person. It's, well, I've got to start, and I've got to actively practice them until they become a habit. And that's what virtue ethics is about.
What would at least be better?
Yeah. And that's what ethical holism is, I think. And the interesting part that is the conflict then with animal liberation ethics, and this is what we're going to do as we reconcile just now, is that it does allow the harm of animals, natural entities and people. So a vegan might say you shouldn't kill and eat animals, but the land ethicist says it's all right. It makes sense. The hunter, the wolf, is a very important part of the ecosystem. So the act of killing and eating an animal is not a bad thing in and of itself. And so this is where we can begin to try and reconcile.
Right. And I think before I mentioned these kinds of, I kind of flagged up or introduced the idea of these kinds of sometimes quite complex cases like the honey industry. I mean, another one that just springs to mind with, talking about like killing and butchering animals to eat, is the fact that in like North America, like a majority of the funding for conservation of like elk native to quite a lot of the regions of like, I think it's like boreal forest. I don't know enough about forest to describe that properly. But a majority of the funding is surprisingly from hunting foundations.
And it's the same in the savannah, in Africa. Yeah.
Of like, actually there are and these are the kinds of things which, when I think in this kind of like employing measures in their own life as part of like animal liberation ethics as like a reactionary ethic to the like our current treatment of animals. I think that sometimes there's a tendency to overstep what animal liberation ethics is trying to achieve in terms of these, of like what will quite often happen, and I think in pretty much most people's experience with people who are like ethical vegans, is like veganism itself is a diet, right?
Yeah.
It just means you're eating plant stuff and not using animal products. Like, there's nothing more to it.
Yeah.
Like, just doing that doesn't imply...
And it's ethical veganism that is the
Right.
position.
It's like, it doesn't entail any kinds of moral commitments. It just means that you're eating those foods, right? But
like
what will often happen... Yeah, exactly, right. But like, what will often happen is that... I talked about animal liberation ethics as a collection of ideas, as you'll get proponents bleeding their own meta-ethical commitments into the narrative, right? And then saying things for these complex cases, being like, there is no circumstance in which an animal should be killed, or like,
which is a very extreme,
which is a very extreme position to have, right?
Yeah.
But that's often what happens. Is like, animal liberation ethics as a reaction to the moral culture sometimes gets conflated with meta-ethical positions of the people who propose it, right?
And so I think this is where we find our reconciliation, right? It's in the kind of the aim and scope of the two theories. So animal liberation, as you've mentioned quite a lot, we've both brought attention to the fact that it's a reactionary ethic. And so it's been born out of this, direct response to our current ethical default. And I think, there's a tendency with that as well to just try and, if you're trying to pull the kind of the ethical position of society from here to here, it's easier to go over there to try and drag them even further. And I think that's where, some people could genuinely hold the view that it's wrong in any cases for an animal to be killed. But I think if you break that down, I think the Leopoldian aspect makes a lot more sense if you're within that system. And so this is where the aim and scope is, right? So the aim of animal liberation ethics is to drag people away from the cultural default, right? And the scope of it is as a reactionary ethic within the framework of this cultural default. Whereas, ethical holism, if we think about the scope of that, is, it's a whole new framework, it's a whole new methodology for ethics. It's not a response to what's going on in our society at the moment. It's developing a new moral system. So the aim, so to say, of ethical holism is to live an ethical life with an expanded scope to our current moral systems. So it almost seems odd to say that it has an aim, because it's the same aim as consequentialism. It's the same aim as Kantian ethics is to live a moral life.
It's just to be moral.
And it's just a different methodology with a different scope. And so I think this is where we can find that reconciliation, right? Because animal liberation is a direct response to our current ethical framework. Some of the statements that come out, such as killing an animal in any circumstance is wrong, doesn't make sense in an ethical holist framework. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but something that we said on some of our chats before we actually came out here to film was that, in my opinion, a lot of ethical vegans, if they did live in a society that was set up in an ethical holist way, they wouldn't be vegans anymore. And in fact, veganism would only just be a diet, like you said, with no ethical commitments.
Right.
And anyone who then said the thing, killing an animal under any circumstances wrong, would be a whole new different position. There was something I said which we did actually write down, which was
I thought it was great.
Where is it? I can't find it.
It's on one of the...
Oh yes, it's not so much that eating meat is wrong. It's that the system of eating meat right now is wrong.
Right, exactly.
I think is the position of the ethical vegan, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's just the perfect way to kind of capture these positions of... I mean, like I mentioned before, that like I came into this kind of like whole process of like preparing our presentation and thinking about these ideas and discussing them with you.
Yeah.
Already, very much an advocate of the animal liberation movement. And I mean, I remember telling you, like, when I first read the Caldecott paper, it was like, it was crazy, because it was, I also agreed with ethical holism, right? I was like, how can I hold these two
views that Caldecott is saying simultaneously against each other?
Right, I was like, well, I can't hold two ethical positions and agree with both of them. But then definitely it's like, through this kind of process, we've realised it's much more about actually what they're trying to achieve and about the scopes between them, that actually they're quite different things.
Yeah.
And you can compare them in some ways. But
it's the difference between a theory and an applied ethic, isn't it?
Right, exactly, yeah. It's like one is a reactionary social movement, a collection of ideas, are like cool to how you should act in the world and how you should remedy problems that already are, which is very much, in some ways, a virtue ethical like practice, right? It's like...
And like, I think it might have been Caldecott who, objected to, I think, someone saying something along those lines, being like, well, that's not good enough for philosophy, because philosophy should be about precise positions. And I think in just responding to that, you can just say, well, it's not a precise position, and that's the point. It's more I don't want to say political, but like it's deliberately practical.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like raising the objection of action guidance to virtue ethics, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's meant to tell us exactly what to do. Is what you're trying to say to virtue ethics. It's objection. And it's less about right. It's about being able to right. It's about what you being able to doing and trying to make sense of what you get. In the same way, I think virtue ethics is about trying to achieve better society.
Yeah.
And maybe that may not look laws if we can make it properly moral.
Yeah. We've been going for quite a while.
We have, yeah.
I think that's probably all that we've done in an hour and 10 minutes.
Damn, an hour and 10 minutes.
So if anyone has watched this whole thing, I hope it's been recording the whole time.
I hope so. We might have run out of space. We might just be talking to a turned off camera this whole time.
That would be fun. But we think certainly that we've reconciled the two. No? And so if you watch this and you disagree with us, or you have any thoughts or objections to what we said, or even if you do agree that we've reconciled them, or anything that we spoke about earlier, or something you think we missed, then do let us know. We apologise for it being so long.
Yeah.
We thought it was going to be about half an hour.
Yeah, but
because we did say short debate in our email to Joanna.
We did say short debate.
But things
we hope
happen.
You like this anyway, Joanna.
Yeah.
And Anthony. Thank you for your argument.
Thank you for
cheers.
taking the time.
Yeah, it's been a great process.
Yeah, and cool.
And so the basic idea is that we have some type of obligation to non-human animals because we have indirect obligations to them, right? Wait, did I say that right?
Yeah, I think you did.
Yeah.
So we've
It's okay, I can just
we got some walkers coming about.
I'll just cut this.
Yeah, that's fine. Go on, keep going.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Okay. You have like XYZ treatments of animals that are fairly commonplace. So I know you butcher them for meat, skin them for leather or like other kinds of products.
Sure.
And like harvest their labour. And if you value things like freedom of property, consent, and not appropriating the property of others, and these are quite cross-domain, it's political and stuff, but if you value those things, which people tend to do, then